Today we will learn and reflect on this question. Was the Rough Rider President Theodore Roosevelt a proponent of civil rights? And this question does not have a simple answer. And this question is somewhat personal for me. He was my favorite president in my youth. I read his standard biographies and his autobiographies and most of the books that he himself wrote. And I even named my son Theodore. So I really want to answer yes to this question, but unfortunately in politics, like in relationships, often the answer is complicated. Theodore Roosevelt was a reforming president. His accomplishments included fighting monopolies by trust busting, regulating the food and drugs sold to consumers, conservation efforts including establishing national parks, fighting corruption in government, and promoting merit-based civil service. Soon after becoming president, he invited the black educator Booker T. Washington to dinner in the White House to explore what progress could be made on civil rights. Roosevelt was stunned by the immediate vitriolic blowback from the Southern press and politicians. He realized that if he attempted civil rights reforms, that his entire reform package would be blocked, and he would accomplish nothing. But his Justice Department did attempt to litigate against the Deep South peonage or convict labor abuses. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video. Please feel free to follow along in the PowerPoint script we uploaded to SlideShare. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. Theodore Roosevelt was not a man bound by class, which can be seen in the composition of the Rough Rider volunteer regiment that he organized to fight in the Spanish-American War. The newspaper publicity hyping his heroic charge leading his Rough Rider regiment up San Juan Hill made him a household name, eventually propelling him to the presidency. Roosevelt, like his distant cousin Franklin, was a member of the patrician class, which meant that, of course, he attended Harvard University. After serving in the New York State Legislature, Roosevelt was devastated when both his beautiful young wife Alice and his mother passed away on the same day, just 2 days after the birth of his daughter, also named Alice. For solace, he purchased a cattle ranch in North Dakota, developing many friendships among the rough-riding cowboys in this western state. Thus, his Rough Rider recruits were an unlikely mix of wealthy, blue-blooded aristocrats and tough and rough-and-ready cowboys from the Badlands. And this is a picture of the Rough Riders fighting their way to the top of San Juan Hill despite heavy enemy fire. And this American victory led to the Spanish surrender 2 weeks later. Now, Roosevelt's Rough Riders were not the only regiments charging up San Juan Hill. History books often do not mention the role of the colored regiment Buffalo Soldiers in the Spanish-American War. During the war, Roosevelt was chided for fraternizing with the enlisted men, and this criticism makes more sense if he fraternized both with his Rough Riders and the Buffalo Soldiers, which have an interesting history of their own. And this is another painting of the Buffalo Soldiers charging up San Juan Hill. William McKinley preceded Theodore Roosevelt to the presidency. Before he ascended to the presidency, Theodore Roosevelt was vice president under the Republican William McKinley in his second term. McKinley had first been elected president in 1896, and during his first term the economy was prosperous and the United States was victorious in the Spanish-American War, adding the territories of Puerto Rico and Philippines to the United States. Although he had condemned lynching and approved the recruiting of black officers in the Spanish-American War, fewer blacks were appointed to federal positions, and the federal government was reluctant to oppose violent white supremacists, even when they staged a coup and seized control of the local government in the Wilmington insurrection of 1898. For his re-election campaign of 1900, the popular Rough Rider and vigorous campaigner Theodore Roosevelt was tapped to be the vice presidential candidate, since Vice President Garrett Hobart had passed away. 6 months into his second term, William McKinley was assassinated by a disgruntled anarchist, and Theodore Roosevelt was thrust into the presidency. The first reports after the assassination attempt were that the president's condition was improving and he would likely recover. But on the morning of Friday, September 13, 1901, a messenger was sent to summon Theodore Roosevelt to return to Washington. But after several hours, they discovered he had gone mountain climbing. Later that afternoon, a guide informed him of this news on his descent. When he boarded a special train at dawn, he learned that President McKinley had succumbed to his wounds and infection. One of Roosevelt's first actions as president was to invite the black leader Booker T. Washington to a White House dinner. Now, Booker T. Washington was the foremost black leader of his generation. He had risen from being an illiterate plantation field slave freed by the Northern victory in the Civil War to a leading educator and fundraiser for the Tuskegee Institute and also other black colleges. While his mentor, General Armstrong of the Hampton Institute, was asked by a member of the Alabama legislature if he could recommend a white administrator to establish a new black trade school, he replied that he knew a very talented young black educator that would be perfect for the job, his former student, Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington quickly discovered that the Alabama legislature had only appropriated funds for teacher salaries. He was on his own to find some ramshackle classrooms. Now, Tuskegee was a liberal college town, or a liberal by Deep South standards, and he was able to raise funds for his black college trade school locally. That's the Tuskegee Institute, during the darkest times of the Jim Crow redemptionist era when lynchings of blacks were rampant. Now, Tuskegee Institute not only trained black educators, they also taught useful trades. And they learned these trades by helping build the schools, and they even learned how to fire the bricks to build the school in a brick kiln that they constructed. Very few black students had any money for tuition, so soon the financial needs of Tuskegee Institute outstripped the resources of local benefactors. So again, with the help of his mentor, General Armstrong, he started fundraising up north so Tuskegee Institute could expand its programs. And he often spent 6 months of the year speaking and fundraising among northern businessmen and tycoons. The sales cycle for this type of fundraising is so long that he was forced to cater to the prejudices of his white benefactors. And he was not free to offer the freewheeling criticisms and protests of the more activist W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a co-founder of the activist NAACP organization. Now, William McKinley was friendly to Booker T. Washington and had visited Tuskegee Institute during his first term. Henry Pringle, who was Theodore Roosevelt's biographer, writes, "Politically, the nomination depended largely on the control of the Southern delegates, who were in 1901 still in Hanna's hands. Now, Mark Hanna was a Republican senator and chairman of the Republican National Committee with ties to big business, who was McKinley's campaign manager." And Pringle also writes, "Roosevelt had arranged to visit Tuskegee Institute in the early fall, and Booker T. Washington had agreed to build a new Republican organization in the South, an organization based on character instead of patronage and bribery." Now, a trip to Tuskegee had been planned for November 1901, and he had been entertained either at Roosevelt's home in Oyster Bay or at the White House prior to this famous dinner. Now, in the years after the Civil War, the Republican Party had become more and more the party of big business, and less the party of civil rights. And the party's concern for defending due process and voting rights for black citizens faded over time. And a cartoon by Puck illustrates this vividly. We have the lone black man Booker T. Washington leapfrogging in the bottom of the picture. But he was outnumbered and overshadowed by several business tycoons, including Andrew Carnegie, who was the dominant philanthropist for the Tuskegee Institute. Now, on the day Roosevelt took the oath of office on the train at Buffalo, New York, he wrote to Booker T. Washington requesting that they meet to discuss federal appointments for blacks. In late September, Booker T. Washington was invited to dine at the White House with the president and his family, discussing plans for the Deep South. Our biographer Pringle states that Booker T. Washington felt that Roosevelt wanted to help not only the Negro, but the whole South. But Roosevelt was totally ignorant of how Southerners would react. For the President of the United States to entertain a nigger was unforgivable. Having done so, Roosevelt could no longer hope that the South might be reconciled to the GOP. And Pringle sampled some of the reactions by the Deep South newspapers to Roosevelt's White House dinner guests. The New Orleans Times Democrat demanded, "White men of the South, how do you like it? When Mr. Roosevelt sits down to dinner with a Negro, he declares that the Negro is the social equal of the white man." The Memphis Scimitar screamed that Roosevelt had perpetrated the most damnable outrage ever. And the editor of the Richmond Times portrayed the president as believing that blacks and whites might even intermarry. And the Democrat Senator Benjamin Tillman of South Carolina said that we shall have to kill 1,000 niggers to get them back in their places. And Roosevelt was stunned by the violent reactions to a simple dinner invitation. In the future, Booker T. Washington would be received only during business hours. And if he did come for dinner, it was done in secret. The Southern Republicans would never forgive Roosevelt for this unforgivable breach of racial etiquette, as multiple footnotes in Doris Kearns Goodwin's biography attest. These attitudes did not disappear. During the presidency of the Republican Herbert Hoover, a similar incident occurred when his wife invited Jessie DePriest, and she was the wife of a newly elected black congressman from Chicago, to tea along with other white wives of congressmen. Again, vitriolic attacks from the Southern press. Although Hoover did not have a stellar civil rights record, as we recounted in our video on the history of the NAACP and W.E.B. Du Bois, the First Lady did hold her ground and refused to snub and shun Jessie DePriest. Now, an incident usually excluded from the biographies of Theodore Roosevelt was a long-running civil rights legal struggle begun under his administration combating the horrors of the peonage convict labor system of the Deep South, which was actually a system of random slavery, which was often even more cruel than the plantation slavery before the Civil War. The 13th Amendment has a loophole that permits the involuntary servitude of convicted prisoners. So Southern sheriffs would round up young black men on false vagrancy charges and sell their slave gang labor to the highest bidder or to their friends. And you can see in the thumbnail that sometimes children were caught up in what were really concentration camps that sometimes rivaled the Nazi work camps in their brutality and mortality rate. In some counties of the Deep South, Alabama, there were thousands of convict laborers slaving on dozens of plantations. Even when cases were proven, Southern juries just would not convict. The sources mention Attorney General Knox, but these cases must have had the enthusiastic support of Roosevelt, although due to the reaction of inviting a black man to dinner dissuaded him from publicizing this struggle. The issue of peonage simmered, sometimes generating harsh newspaper headlines and state legislative investigating committee reports for several decades. But the system of peonage was not abolished until the New Deal administration of FDR, when embarrassing comparisons could be made to the Nazi concentration work camps. Blackman, the author of the book that we reviewed for that video, says this about convict labor. The quasi-slavery of the 20th century was rooted in the nascent industrial slavery that flourished in the last years of the Civil War. The same men who built railroads with thousands of slaves and proselytized for the use of slaves in southern factories and mines in the 1850s were also the first to employ forced African American labor in the 1870s. Most southern states enacted vagrancy laws by 1865 that were so vaguely worded that any blacks could be arrested if they were on the streets and not working. Some states enacted laws making it illegal for black workers to change employers without permission. So what was the relationship between W.E.B. Du Bois and Theodore Roosevelt? We found no indication that W.E.B. Du Bois ever met with Theodore Roosevelt during his presidency or his campaigns, although he did introduce Roosevelt before one of his last speeches in 1918. In his autobiography, W.E.B. Du Bois does mention that Roosevelt attempted to break up the business trust monopolies, although the Supreme Court blocked his actions. After the intense pushback by Southern segregationists after his dinner with Booker T. Washington, it is credible that Theodore Roosevelt would backpedal, appealing for white racial purity in a Lincoln Day address in 1905. During a swing through the South later that year, he stressed his mother's Southern birth, lectured the Tuskegee undergraduates about the dangers of falling into crime, and derided African Americans as a backward race. And the Roosevelt administration chose not to get involved in the white supremacist Atlanta race riots in 1906, although the administration did approve a handful of black federal appointments. When Roosevelt was later running to be re-elected as president under the Progressive Bull Moose Party in 1912, W.E.B. Du Bois suggested in the Crisis magazine that a civil rights plank be added to the party platform. But Theodore Roosevelt did not want to be involved with the dangerous W.E.B. Du Bois, who was known both as an activist and as a contrarian. Although the Progressive Party denied convention seats to African American delegates to appease the lily-white Southerners, many blacks admired the progressive proposals of an 8-hour workday, 6-day work week, accident, old age, and unemployment insurance, and female suffrage. Now, the minor civil rights gestures of the Roosevelt administration were overshadowed by the tragic Brownsville affair. the Army foolishly transferred a battalion of Black Buffalo soldiers from Nebraska to the Deep South segregationist town of Brownsville, Texas. In her biography of Theodore Roosevelt, Doris Kearns Goodwin tells us about many minor confrontations. Black soldiers were forced off the sidewalk, hit with revolver butts, and denied access to public bars. Rumors of a black soldier assaulting a white woman in her home circulated. Then, just past midnight on August 14th, a group of soldiers had allegedly entered town and fired into buildings, killing a saloon keeper and so grievously injuring the chief of police that his arm was later amputated. She continues, eyewitnesses produced contradictory accounts. Some claimed that the townspeople had fired first. Others pointed to colored soldiers in khaki and blue shirts as the aggressors. No one could identify any of the individual soldiers, all of whom had returned to the barracks immediately after the shootings. Now, the more judicious Secretary of War and future President Howard Taft was away from Washington on official business when this crisis blew up, so it was handled by the impulsive President Theodore Roosevelt. Now, these were tough soldiers. They included several Medal of Honor recipients, and some of these soldiers had served beside Roosevelt's Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War and had also battled the Sioux and Filipino guerrillas. These tough soldiers would not break rank to reveal who among their ranks were guilty of these outrages. So President Roosevelt delivered on his threat to dishonorably discharge the entire 167-man battalion, which prevented them from re-enlisting and from applying to civil service positions. Taft eventually persuaded Roosevelt to soften his position. He revoked the provision preventing the discharged soldiers from civil jobs with the government and allowed individual soldiers who could prove they were not involved to be reinstated. African Americans were universally appalled at this harsh sentence. Even Booker T. Washington warned Taft that he had never in all my experience of the race experienced a time when the entire people have the feeling that they now have in regard to the administration. His associates said that Roosevelt's name would be anathema with Negroes from now on. One black preacher lamented, "Once enshrined in our love as our Moses, now Roosevelt is now enshrouded in our scorn as our Judas." The Brownsville affair embittered W.E.B. Du Bois. He declared in an article in Horizon that Theodore Roosevelt does not like black folk. He has no faith in them. Stoking the coals, he asked, "What do we have to thank Roosevelt for? For asking a black man to dine with him? For appointing a few black men to federal positions? For saying publicly that the door of opportunity ought to be held open for the colored men?" But Mr. Roosevelt, by his word and deed, since has slammed this door most emphatically in the black man's face. So what does Theodore Roosevelt say about this affair? He omits painful memories from his autobiography. He doesn't mention the death of his first wife, nor does he mention the White House dinner with Booker T. Washington, and he also does not mention the Brownsville affair in his autobiography. Which brings us to another question. Should Theodore Roosevelt's statue have been removed from the Museum of Natural History in New York City? The New York Times reported in June 2020 that the bronze statue of Theodore Roosevelt on horseback and flanked by a Native American man and an African man, which has presided over the entrance of the American Museum of Natural History in New York since 1940, is coming down. And it continues, for many, the equestrian statue at the museum's Central West Park entrance has come to symbolize a painful legacy of colonial expansion and racial discrimination. Now, in the near future, it will be moved to and displayed on the grounds of the Theodore Roosevelt Library in Medora, North Dakota. Local citizens certainly have the right to decide what statues will be displayed in their cities. And you can argue either that the figures of the Indian and the black man represent racial equality, or they might also represent subservience. Now, in my humble opinion, statues that were not symbolic of Jim Crow oppression should be left standing. And we should be reluctant to condemn too harshly historic figures who held opinions considered objectionable by today's standards. After all, neither Plato nor Aristotle condemned slavery. Now, Theodore Roosevelt was not immune to the prejudices of his age. He admired the notion of Rudyard Kipling of the white man's burden spreading colonialism to the ignorant masses. As Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he had authorized the seizing of the Philippine Islands at the beginning of the Spanish-American War. And as we noted, the Black Buffalo soldiers were among the forces fighting Filipino forces seeking independence. Lewis's footnote is not clear about the source, but perhaps Theodore Roosevelt did say, "The perfectly stupid race can never rise to a very high plane. The Negro, for instance, has been kept down as much by a lack of intellectual development as by anything else." And Lewis also reports that Roosevelt wrote an article on Brazil and the Negro after his trip there in 1914. Although he commended the lack of a color bar in Brazilian society, he did claim that Brazilians regarded the Negro element in their blood as a slight weakening. Colonialism was finally doomed when World War II proved how little security Great Britain could provide when Japanese forces attacked her Asian colonies and threatened Australia and India. Now we'll discuss the sources we use for this video. Henry Pringle wrote the definitive biography of Theodore Roosevelt, but Doris Kearns Goodwin always finds a unique perspective that reveals interesting details not found in other biographies. In her Bully Pulpit, she tells us the biographies of both Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, who were friends and close associates during his presidency when Taft was the Secretary of War, but they became bitter rivals when Theodore Roosevelt ran against Taft as a third-party candidate for the Progressive Bull Moose Party, throwing the election to Woodrow Wilson and the Democrats. And her biography also focuses on Roosevelt's alliance with the muckraking journalists that helped sell many of his reforms. The autobiographies of Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Theodore Roosevelt are all captivating, but they have scant mention of the relationship between Theodore Roosevelt and W.E.B. Du Bois, and many of the topics we covered in this video. And this video is part of our series of videos reviewing the biography and autobiography of W.E.B. Du Bois. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.